Thank you very much, Norbert. It's a very great pleasure to be here. I'll try to stay on time, as usual. I want to talk to you about language, I want to come at language in a way that we don't conventionally come at language, in a way that might cause us to question what we mean by that word language. And this is very much in the spirit of the talk we heard this morning from Alexander. I suspect there'll be resonances going forward, perhaps to Stephen's talk tomorrow. We shall see what we shall see. The specific kind of speech I'm going to talk about, I have christened joint speech. And I can define this very simply. Joint speech is when multiple people say the same thing at the same time. There, that was simple, didn't it? No recursivity involved. This is a very familiar form of speech which everybody engages in. You have all engaged in joint speech regularly. There are many other terms in this area, such as chant, for example, which in English at least nicely spans the border between speech and music. For one interesting thing about this domain is that there is no longer a border between speech and music. Joint speech straddles, we find very speech-like joint speech, and we find very music-like joint speech, and everything in between. So I will give up on trying to make a distinction between speech and music here. Choral speaking is a certain performative art, very popular in Southeast Asia and in Ireland, where it's a competitive sport, where bunches of children get up and recite poems for their proud parents. Perhaps you have something similar in France, I don't know. Synchronous speech is a laboratory variant, again christened by me, I'm afraid, because there hasn't been much work done in the area, where you get two people into the laboratory and you say, here's a text, read it together, 3, 2, 1, go. And people can do this very easily. Unison speech was also available as a possible term, but there's too many syllables, so we'll go with joint speech. And we find it in places like rituals and prayers, rituals both religious and secular. We find it also in protest, we find it in sports. There's a whole wealth of interesting phenomena in the educational domain, particularly in the education of young children. And where we're just going to take a little walk and discuss some aspects of this extraordinarily rich human behavior. My definition of what we're looking at, joint speech, multiple people saying the same thing at the same time, is deliberately simple. It allows us to circumvent a lot of definitional problems and to develop this as a tool for examining human practices in various fields. If we come at human behavior generally and we say, well, where do people say the same thing at the same time? We pick out areas that themselves are very hard to define. So in ritual studies, one of the longest lasting questions is, what is a ritual? A coronation or a Catholic mass are rituals, but is brushing your teeth before you go to bed a ritual? For some people it is, for some people it isn't. We can circumvent a lot of those problems by using this definition and saying, let's go where joint speech takes us. And it takes us into rituals, takes us to practices of prayer, takes us also into the most violent of demonstrations and protest marches, where chanting is going on in the streets across the Arab Spring, for example. And oddly enough, as if prayer and protest weren't sufficiently strange bedfellows, it takes us to the terraces of the football matches, where we have football supporters enacting their identity as Manchester United fans or what have you. Very culturally bound. Not every sport has such a tradition. Rugby doesn't. Soccer does. Chanting in snooker would be frankly bizarre. It's a very rare occurrence in tennis, but it's completely frequent in soccer. So we're interested. This empirical starting point provides us with a tool for peering into these domains of practice. And that in itself, for me, provides a useful starting point. I want to ask questions both about what makes the joint speech in these specific domains specific to that domain, what separates these domains, but also what transcends them. And that, of course, is going to be my particular focus. I think that's where this gets interesting, is when we spot commonalities that extend across these domains. I'm going to spend a little bit of time, first of all, picking out some obvious surface features that transcend these domains. One of the first is this bizarre phenomenon that in joint speaking, the classic distinction between speakers and listeners is gone. Now, we know we're already dealing with language in a slightly odd way because we don't have speakers and listeners passing messages around. Everybody knows the text. And believe me, if God is listening in on the rosary, he's heard it before. Right? So everybody knows the damn texts. So what's going on there? We get this repetition, repetition. So obvious a feature of joint speech, it features as an injunction in the Bible where they rail against the vain repetitions of the heathen. So why are people repeating? Well, the answer is, of course, I'm making use of our common ground here as an activist because something is going on in the performance of this. There's a performativity to joint speech. Taking part is what matters. We have the enactment perhaps of an identity. Maybe I'll take a little distance from that. I don't really know. But clearly what's important in saying the prayer, swearing the oath, chanting the team's football thing is that it gets done. This is not something that's textual. This is much older than literate culture. This goes right back to the root of humanity. It's a very central languaging behavior of humans that has not really been addressed, and that is perhaps its most interesting feature. Today, in most of my talk, I'm going to focus on something I don't normally talk about, so I'm trying out some new stuff on you guys. I hope this works. I want to talk about specific structural features that we find when joint speech is in play. I want to talk about the role of call and response and its relation to propositional complexity. And I want to talk about something I will call general assent. But before I do all that, I want to make a case to you on the basis of an example that joint speech is not just lots of people speaking individually. And to do that, you're academics. I'm not going to say to you, are you having a good time and do this and expect you all to go, yeah, because everyone would be slightly embarrassed if I did. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to witness and perhaps take part in something which is a limiting case. You may object this is not joint speech at all. I'll insist it is joint speech, but it's joint speech in which we are silent together. Now, if you're silent on your own, you're just not saying anything. But if we are silent together, deliberately, it means something different. And I want to deliberately use an example of a moment's silence, minute's silence after the atrocities of last November in Paris at a football match, thereby uniting several domains. And I think if we listen in, we'll see what the power of silence is. Thank you for not interrupting that. I can never interrupt this, certainly in a French context. I think it's a very graphic demonstration of the participatory nature of this collective activity, even if it is a limiting case. So with joint speech, we have something that is at the center of highly valued practices and rituals in every human culture, and I do not know of any stage in human history where this was not the case. It is accorded the highest significance by practitioners. It is obviously some kind of magic power for enacting something, whether it's collective identity, we'll talk a little bit about what to say there. But perhaps the most interesting thing is that there's sweet Fanny Adams science in the area. There is no science in the area. There is 10 times as much science in the area of the bizarre practice of speaking in tongues as there is in this widespread practice of speaking together. I find that odd. It is not impossible to do science in this area. I've spent the last 10 years contributing a little bit here from a phonetician's point of view. That's my home domain. The kind of stability that we see in the speech production here is remarkable. I don't have time to talk about it. Movement science is a domain I have also worked in, where we see and can demonstrate formal coupling between speakers in a very interesting way. We can even do, God help us, neuroscience on this damn thing and show the cortical activity when speaking in real-time communion with another person. That was a provocative word, did you notice that? Real-time reciprocal interaction with another person, cortical activity is different than when we speak even in unison with a recording, so that the live co-presence is evident in cortical activity, even when the speaker doesn't know whether they're speaking with a person or a recording. That's kind of interesting. And Dan Richardson in UCL has done some nice social psychology, which is not my domain, showing that it's chanting together improves some sort of collective behavior. So you can do science in the area, no matter what kind of scientist you are. The problem, the reason for the absence, lies elsewhere. And now, I don't normally get away with this quite so bluntly in front of an audience of psychologists, but with a bunch of people in enactive theory, I'm just going to say, here's some instructions for creating a golem. Introspect. You're done. Descartes hiding in his cave, looking in, hearing, oddly enough, a French voice in his head saying, Je suis, j'existe, in his solipsistic universe, thereby taking part in a collective practice of French languaging. Introspection is a devil. I'm picking up now on this morning's wonderful talk from Alexander, where he bemoans this view of language as being about the passing of secret messages from one domain to another. In fact, Tom was talking about the same thing, which makes our individual existence, spheres of existence, look like this, and the business of languaging look like this. I'm not sure this corresponds to what happens when we actually speak to each other. And we are talking here about speaking. Textual elements do not feature here. This is not text. This is what people look like when they actually engage with one another. It's whole bodies. They are present to each other. They are involved in each other's going on very much in real time. So this makes this an interesting domain, I believe, for an enactive perspective on language. And now I'm going to posit a thesis that I'm still working on. I still need to flesh this out because, as always in the domain of enaction, I'm somewhat linguistically challenged because our words are charged with the development of ideas in our specific social historical context that we need somehow to challenge. I'm going to say that the voice, the act of uttering, gives rise to a subject. Now this subject is not a mind. This subject is not a psychological subject. It's not a cognitive system, and it most assuredly is not a soul. It's a fleeting domain brought into being through the act of uttering, with respect to which intentionality can be pegged. There is now someone or some domain for which things exist. So that teleological aspect comes into being. And on this view, this subject, which is a term we still have to negotiate carefully, is not a fixed and permanent entity. And I've used this slide a few times, and then it struck me last night after a few beers, there's one thing missing from this slide. Because this makes it look like magic. And I don't think it's magic. The voice, when heard, gives rise to the subject. Now Descartes is speaking to himself in his cave, so that is a voice. All voices are heard. There's no such thing as a voice in the forest where nobody hears, because the utterer hears, right? So when there's a heard voice, I'm going to say there's a transient subject pole. Now this is not really a startlingly original observation. In De Anima, Aristotle said that the voice is a kind of sound of an ensouled thing. That's nous here, not psyche. And he said when we use this, we speak of the sweet voice of the lyre, for example, we're fabricating. We're borrowing a term that is at home with the holders of souls. We are extending it to something that does not have a soul, which is an interesting observation. It's a little old and I feel a little bogus citing Aristotle, but I want to point to a wonderful book by Stephen Connor of Cambridge called Dumbstruck, published in 2000, which is a history of ventriloquism. It's a very interesting account of the story of voices coming from unexpected places. Ventriloquism we often think of as something to do with children and puppets. Tell that to the Delphic Oracle, where you've got a voice accorded the highest authority coming out of a very strange place indeed. Throughout the Middle Ages, if voices come from the odd places, you're dealing with a case of spirit possession, demonic possession. We need an exorcist in the house. Even to this day, when we put a voice into a children's puppet and call it a ventriloquist entertainment, we spawn a subgenre of horror films. So what is it when a voice comes from the genitals or a voice comes from the corner of the room? We never ask, how did the corner of the room learn to speak? How did the genitals learn to speak? We say, who's in there? Right? There's a subject behind it. We obligatorily project a subject onto the voice. And here I find my considerations in trying to develop a language to properly deal with these phenomena. I find myself drawn to the language of enactivism. Notice I'm not making a pitch to say what enactivism is or is not. I'm simply saying that the language, the form of discussion going on here turns out to be useful for my concerns. In particular, I want to get away, as many of you do, from the idea that there is a fixed set divide between subject and object, and I want to get into the more nuanced, dynamic and negotiated business of looking at relationships between, well, now we're stuck for words. Subject and environment. A lot of people don't like environment, that sounds like trees and recycling, so maybe we'll say milieu. We'll use it in the sense of two things that codifying each other, but subject, I'm not sure. Didn't we mean mind, or do we mean soul? Sorry, I didn't say soul system. Yes, there's a lot to negotiate here, but when we're dealing with questions of subjectivity, this is where I find the kind of vocabulary that can help me to address these concerns. In particular, the notion of sense-making, I think, is a very powerful notion. It still needs work in being fleshed out. It's very difficult to inject this into contemporary discussions because we're still bound up with a psychological vocabulary in terms where we talk of things like perception, for example. I can't even talk of perception anymore, but sense-making makes a lot of sense to me. Everybody knows that diagram, right? That's a system, it's a something. It's one of those things, and it is in regulated, controlled interaction, exchange with that other wavy thing, right? Words, who needs words? In its obstinate persistence as a dynamical unity, maintained in precarious circumstances, the system's activity enacts a world. Everybody's familiar with this language here. Thank the Lord God above. This makes my job a little bit easier. Okay, and in particular, as we extend this notion to participatory sense-making, which I think was a wonderful interjection and came surprisingly late into the enactive discussion, if my sense-making includes you and yours includes mine, then the sense made is collective or intersubjective. Now, we're using the subject here in a way that is we have to treat extremely cautiously. Anyone who's gone out for a beer with me will know that I'm fond of railing against the Christianity that's latent in our science. And I find one reason the embodied mind was so important as an interjection was just to provide a perspective. It was Buddhist epistemology, but it doesn't really matter as long as it was non-Christian. It doesn't really matter where it's coming from, because this notion of subject and world needs to be treated. We need a little bit more distance from it, shall we say, than we've had. So I want to push back against notion of soul, which any talk of mind for me is just soul talk. And I know that's great, lovely. I see a reason for soul talk, but I don't see a science of souls. Right? And cognitive system is just that, all rebranded and wrapped up, and the psychological subject is the same. I want to illustrate to you, perhaps. Now, I haven't said anything definite. All I've said is I don't have the right words. But let's have a look at an example now, which is definitely different from that rather peaceful, tranquil example we had. We're going to travel in time back outside the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem to a case of some disturbance. There's been a bit of tear gas and rioting and such like. Just watch what happens. Before the chanting breaks out, there is one super individual entity. It's the Israeli riot police. They're all dressed identically and they share a common purpose. They're there with a common purpose and they act with common purpose. Beyond that, there are civilians who are dispersed and individual, and that's one of the reasons it's so chaotic. As soon as the chanting breaks out, there's now another entity to stand in opposition to the riot police. We can perceive this very directly. That's what I mean by a collective subject. And that's the word that we need to figure out. The chant, incidentally, Allahu Akbar, the takbir, is grotesquely misunderstood outside of Islam, I think. It serves very, very many purposes. It's an interesting phrase. And again, picking up from Alexander here, there's not a lot of syntax in there, right? There's no center embedding or hierarchical structure. It's just Allahu Akbar. And joint speech frequently has this property that it has almost no syntactic complexity. Let's look at another familiar example, perhaps less troubling than all these ones. Everyone's met this on the street sometime. Of course you want to see a show, so you say, yeah, no, what's he doing? This is a technology and he's very good at exploiting it. As soon as everybody says yes, they're committed. They're part of an audience. Prior to that, each person is an individual. Once you all say yes together, gotcha. Right? But the voice of the crowd doesn't have a very good reputation. And this is where I want to go with the second half of the talk. I want to point out that this joint speech is not some degenerate form of speech, simply because it lacks the creative syntactic complexity of a book like Syntactic Structures, for example, does not make it mute and does not make it capable of carrying very highly nuanced, very significant messages. And this has become clearer to me in studying this as I look at the structural features of those occasions where joint speech is employed. And there are certain simple structural features that I find again and again across the domains. And they are telling. The first one I'm going to call mirroring. Mirroring is a case where one person, the leader, says something complex, and everybody else says the same thing back to me. This is usually found in an instrumental context, and the speech so produced is usually speech. There's no musical elements, there's no repetition, there's no fist pumping. It's done once and once only in order to do something. It's used, for example, in swearing an oath of allegiance to a new state as you become a citizen of that state.
I hereby declare on oath. I hereby declare on oath.
So you've seen this. Incidentally, when the Caliph of the Islamic State, al-Baghdadi, gave his first sermon in Mosul, there was a large part of that was exactly of this form, and I read that as a strongly instrumental purpose to say to people, now you're committed, you've taken part in this, so you're done. There's a lot of things to be gleaned from this kind of observation, I suspect. That's mirroring, and I want to distinguish that from chorusing. In chorusing, everybody says the same thing at the same time, but they don't need to be told what it is because they know the goddamn text.
Strong and courageous, do not be afraid, for I am with you, and will never forsake you.
You're all in the wrong job. This is from the Global Leadership Summit, and they're quoting Joshua 1:9, for those of you who are curious. There's not many texts that we can all recite without reference to something written. They're very few, and they are very highly privileged. The most important one, and one I wish to talk about, is the Credo, the overt statement of belief. I believe in one God, Father, Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. The Our Father is another one. I'm speaking from a more or less Christian perspective, because I was born in Ireland, and I'm never going to pretend that I'm some kind of closet Buddhist or something like that. I'm an Irish secular guy who's learned a bit of enaction. The Credo, the exact text that we recite together in chorus, this is where a lot of negotiation goes on. Indeed, the history of Christianity is one council after another where these texts are polished like a fine diamond. They are treated with a great deal of reverence. And if you look at this excerpt from the Nicene Creed, in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son, who with the Father and the Son is adored and glorified. You may have heard this in church somewhere, but that small phrase, and the Son, 1,000 years ago gave rise to an enormous rupture within Christianity that resulted in the Eastern Orthodox churches branching off from the Western that went on to give us Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. That small phrase, and the Son, the argument was whether that should be included. It has its own name, like the Takbir has its name. This is the Filioque. And it has given rise to 1,000 years of disagreement. So this kind of speech is not just the raucous cries of the mob. Now I want to turn to this business of generalized assent, which I see as a very, very important way in which collectivities can partake of an interesting and nuanced message. Everybody here has, I don't know if you've ever been to church. Maybe you have. Even if you've never been to church, you've seen it on TV, right? You've seen the amen. Amen occurs, amen in Judaism and in Islam. We get the amen. We get it in every religion. We get it in protest marches too, where there's someone up there, blah, 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 and everyone goes, yeah! Right? That's generalized assent. When we all join in and we all say yes. What this does is it allows us to distribute the responsibilities of propositional complexity so that we can all take part, but someone takes care of the difficult business of reading the syntax and such like. So everyone, this is inherently dialogical. So I'm more and more influenced by the ideas of Mikhail Bakhtin and the idea that there's no point in looking at an utterance as if it wasn't a response to what went immediately before and what went immediately before. So my present to you now is a little bit of preaching. I want to introduce you to the Reverend Marcus Cosby of Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church from Houston, Texas. And if you're ever in the area, swing by, for God's sake. He is amazing. He's a wonderful preacher, and it's very, very musical. But what I want you to listen to is not so much his words, which frankly don't make a lot of sense in this little excerpt. It doesn't matter. What I want you to notice is the way that he is with the crowd, and the crowd is with him, and the crowd is responding to what he said, and everything he says fuels the crowd, and it is back and forth, a dialogical back and forth. So have a listen.
Now, child of God, this ought to get you happy right here. Because if you don't know anything else about God, you ought to know before you leave this sanctuary today with your God, my God, our God is faithful. That means he's steadfast. That means he's dependable. That means we can count on him. I need 2 or 3 folk in the sanctuary, 2 or 3 folk in the worship center to help me witness to somebody around you who may be on the fence about the faithfulness of our God. I need you to help me testify our God is faithful. If you read Jeremiah's version of Lamentations, chapter 3, verse 22, you'll hear Jeremiah say, it is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, for his compassion fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy... Y'all know something about the faithfulness of God.
And you all know something about preaching. This guy is good. Yeah, I can listen to him 45 minutes on a stretch. I swear to God, he is absolutely brilliant. He's extremely musical. He's very good. But he's in close communion with the crowd, and they are together with him. There's a backwards and forwards. This is not that it's the transcendental right of an Anglican community in which someone has got a great remove, possibly with their back. You know the way they used to turn their back in the congregation. This is very much a together. So, in the absence of a good theoretical account of any of this, I put my hands up, I want to give you a picture. This thing on the left represents to me something that Alexander was talking again about this morning. In a conversation, there's a backwards and forwards. I come from some background, I have some perspective on the world. You come from some background, you have some perspective on the world. We meet and we engage in conversation, which is a kind of a cut and thrust. You do to me, I do to you. That's the backwards and forwards. And we establish some common grounds. That's the kind of green bit in the middle. And that is dynamic. That is changing and constantly negotiating. In fact, I was having a discussion with Alexander out there in the stairwell after his talk, and I visualized it, I didn't tell you this, Alexander, but I visualized this as we were talking, and I could see the common ground growing bigger, and then there was a moment in which we failed to understand each other. I said an index is a symptom, and Alexander said, no, an index is not a symptom, and I could almost feel the green stuff shrinking, and then we built up again, and later on we were able to use the word index in a non-controversial way. It was great fun, because I was thinking of this. I didn't tell you that, right? There in the middle, we have something that seems to pertain to liturgy, to more like this preaching situation where we just saw, where the circle is smaller, the common ground occupies a greater amount, the role of the individual is smaller, individuals still contribute, but this is by and large a collective activity. And over there with the credo, it's all green. Now we're all speaking from a common perspective. This is really, really important because such language forms, such language behavior has been with humanity as far as back as one can see, and seems to be one of the means by which a shared perspective on the world for a given community, us, comes into being. Now, I trained as a linguist, and frankly, there's nothing in linguistics that can speak to this. This is dreadful. I have come across Roy Rappaport's work, his wonderful book, Ritual and Religion in the Making of Humanity, he has definitely picked up on this. He is talking here about ritualized utterances, and he says it's virtually definitive of ritual speech that it's stereotyped and stylized, composed of specific sequences of words that are often archaic. They're not authored by the people who are speaking them. It's repeated under particular, usually well-established circumstances with great stress, often laid upon its precise enunciation. He's got it. He's nailed it. He's picked this out. Of course, the speech goes together with other things. Joint speech is, after all, just a lens. In fact, let me put that another way. Joint speech doesn't create the common order or the logos, but it's a lens through which we have access to the processes and structures by which a common view on the world arises. So I think anthropology and religious studies have something to offer here, and I think we should be talking to those folk. And I want to now move to one last point. I'm well within time. But this is an important point, and interestingly, it's one that came up this morning in Alexander's talk again. I want to talk about time. I want to talk about now, and I want to talk about the relationship of the now. Hello, we're all here right now. What time is it now? Now, it's always now. To the kind of time, the way we treat time in scientific accounts, which is, of course, as a linear sequence extending from Big Bang to Big Crunch, in which everything that happens at a specific date, at a specific time on a clock. Now, so familiar is that linear constructed view of time that we frequently don't notice that it is a construction. I fear with any other audience I would have to work at this, but I think I'm on safe ground here in saying that you guys are well aware of the work that goes into constructing such a view of time. That doesn't make it unreal. You can be constructed, well constructed and real. You can be poorly constructed. This linear view of time is a construction. It involves lots of coordination among people, the development of clocks, the observation of the skies, the adoption of a common stance with respect to the sun rising and setting and the sequences of the seasons, and our understanding of ourselves as coming from somewhere where we're born, going somewhere where we're dying. This required an awful lot of work. And joint speech has been around for an awful long time. And when people speak together in this fashion, they are very much present to each other. These rituals in which such joint speech features are very commonly ways in which the passage of time is marked. And there's several ways. It can be cyclic, as we mark the passing of the seasons. I notice we're coming into Ramadan again, for example, and people will be looking at the skies to see the appearance of the moon in order to signal the start of Ramadan. Hasn't gone away. Or you can use it to mark transitions in a linear passage, for example, from boyhood to manhood, weddings, coronations, that kind of thing. Either way, the oldest form of construction of shared time seems to me to be these kind of rituals in which joint speech is one significant element. It's not by any means the oldest one. Alexander talked of time rooted in experience, of intrinsic perceptual groundedness, of where we all share, as it were, a common sensory motor embedding, as it were. Joint speech is I think this is the first order domain of consensual interaction, but I'm not good at the Maturana vocabulary, so don't hold me to that. So I'm going to wind up, to leave plenty of room for discussion, I'm going to wind up with an example from outside Trinity College in Dublin, just over a year and a half ago. And this happens regularly. It happens every 365 days. I need hardly point out that from a Newtonian or Copernican point of view, midnight on December 31st is not a significant event. Doesn't feature in any kind of physical view of the universe. It is entirely constructed. Everybody here is using joint speech in order to come into the same place at the same time. At that very day, at that very time, my son was having a party and I was in a big room full of drunken teenagers smoking joints and having booze and getting off with each other. And it was all kind of chaotic. And I'm sitting there just going, yeah, this is great fun, having a beer. And suddenly they all stopped. They put down what they were doing and they started counting down. And I should have seen it coming, but I didn't see it coming. And when it happened, I just went, wow. I'll stop.